The singular events called the Gowrie Conspiracy, or the slaying of the Ruthvens, fell out, on evidence which nobody disputes, in the following manner. On August 5th, 1600, the King, James VI, was leaving the stables at the House of Falkland to hunt, when the Master of Ruthven rode up and had an interview with the monarch. This occurred about 7 o'clock in the morning. The Master was a youth of 19. He was residing with his brother, the Earl of Gowrie, aged 22, at the family townhouse in Perth, some 12 or 14 miles from Falkland. The interview being ended, the King followed the hounds, and the chase ended in a kill at about 11 o'clock near Falkland. Thence the King and the Master, with some 15 of the royal retinue, including the Duke of Lennox and the Earl of Mar, rode to Perth. Others of the King's company followed. The whole number may have been, at most, 25. On their arrival at Perth, it appeared that they had not been expected. The Earl had dined at noon, and the royal dinner was delayed till 2 o'clock. After the scanty meal, the King and the Master went upstairs alone, while the Earl of Gowrie took Lennox and others into his garden, bordering on the Tay at the back of the house. While they loitered there eating cherries, a retainer of Gowrie, Thomas Cranstoun, brought a report that the King had already mounted and ridden off through the Isle of Perth. Gowrie called for horses, but Cranstoun told him that his horses were at Scone, 2 miles off. The gentleman then went to the street door of the house, where the porter said that the King had not ridden away. Gowrie re-entered the house, went upstairs, and returning assured Lennox that James had certainly departed. All this is proved on oath by Lennox, Mar, Lindores, and many other witnesses. While the company stood in doubt outside the gate, a turret window above them opened, and the King looked forth, much agitated, shouting "Treason!" and crying for help. With Lennox and most of the others, Mar ran to the rescue up the main staircase of the house, where they were stopped by a locked door which they could not break open. Gowrie had not gone with his guest to aid the King. He was standing in the street asking, "What is the matter? I know nothing," when 2 of the King's household, Thomas and James Erskine, tried to seize him. The treason being perpetrated under Gowrie's own roof, his friends drove the Erskines off, and some of the Murrays of Tullibardine, who were attending a wedding in Perth, surrounded him. Gowrie retreated, drew a sword, and, accompanied by Cranstoun and others, made his way into the quadrangle of his house. At the foot of a small dark staircase, they saw the body of a man lying wounded or dead. Cranstoun now rushed up the dark stairs, followed by Gowrie, 2 Ruthvens, Hugh Moncrieff, Patrick Eviot, and perhaps others. At the head of the narrow spiral stair, they found, in a room called the Gallery Chamber, Sir Thomas Erskine, a Dr. Herries, a young gentleman of the royal household named John Ramsay, and Wilson, a servant, with drawn swords. A fight began. Cranstoun was wounded. He and his friends fled, leaving Gowrie, who had been run through the body by Ramsay. All this while, the other door of the long gallery chamber was ringing under the hammer strokes of Lennox and his company, and the town bell was summoning the citizens. Erskine and Ramsay now locked the door opening on the narrow stair, at which the retainers of Gowrie struck with axes. The King's party, by means of a hammer handed by their friends through a hole in the other door of the gallery, forced the lock and admitted Lennox, Mar, and the rest of the King's retinue. They let James out of a small turret opening from the gallery chamber, and after some dealings with the angry mob and the magistrates of Perth, they conveyed the King to Falkland after nightfall. The whole results were the death of Gowrie and of his brother, the Master. His body it was that lay at the foot of the narrow staircase, and a few wounds to Ramsay, Dr. Herries, and some of Gowrie's retainers. The death of the Master of Ruthven was explained thus. When James cried, "Treason!" young Ramsay from the stable door had heard his voice, but not his words. He had sped into the quadrangle, charged up the narrow stairs, found a door behind which was the sound of a struggle, burst open the door and saw the King wrestling with the Master. Behind them stood a man of whom he took no notice. He drew his blade, slashed the Master in the face and throat, and pushed him downstairs. Ramsay then called from the window to Sir Thomas Erskine, who, with Herries and Wilson, ran to his assistance, slew the wounded Master, and secured James in the turret. Then came the struggle in which Gowrie died. No more was seen of the mysterious man in the turret. Such was the whole affair as witnessed by the King's men, the retainers of Gowrie, and some citizens of Perth. Not a vestige of plot or plan by Gowrie and his party was discoverable. His friends maintained that he had meant on that day to leave Perth for his castle at near North Berwick, whither he had sent most of his men and provisions. James had summoned the master to meet him at Falkland, they said, and Gowrie had never expected the return of the master with the king. James's own version was given in a public letter of the night of the events. At the end of August, James printed and circulated a full narrative, practically identical with the contents of the Falkland letter. The king's narrative is universally accepted on all hands, till we come to the point where he converses with Alexander Ruthven at Falkland before the buck hunt began. There was such an interview, lasting for about a quarter of an hour, but James alone knew its nature. He says that after an unusually low obeisance, Ruthven told the following tale. Walking alone on the previous evening in the fields near Perth, he had met a base-like fellow, unknown to him, with a cloak cast about his mouth, a common precaution to avoid recognition. Ruthven seized him and under his arm found a great wide pot, all full of coined gold in great pieces. Ruthven, keeping the secret to himself, took the man to Perth and locked him in a room. At 4 in the morning he himself left Perth to tell the king, urging him to take order in the matter at once, as not even Lord Gowrie knew of it. When James said that it was no business of his, Ruthven called him over-scrupulous, adding that his brother, Gowrie, and other great men might interfere. James then, suspecting that the gold might be foreign brought in by Jesuits for the use of Catholic intriguers, asked what the coins and their bearer were like. Ruthven replied that the bearer seemed to be a Scots fellow, hitherto unknown to him, and that the gold was apparently of foreign mintage. James felt sure that the gold was foreign, and the bearer a disguised Scottish priest. He therefore proposed to send back with Ruthven a retainer of his own with a warrant to Gowrie, then Provost of Perth, to take over the man and the money. Ruthven said the man might make a noise and discover the whole affair, causing the treasure to be meddled with. He himself would be missed by Gowrie, whereas, if James came at once, Gowrie and the townsfolk would be at the sermon. James made no answer but followed the hounds. Still he brooded over the story, sent for Ruthven, and said that the hunt once ended, he would accompany him to Perth. Here James adds that though he himself knew not that any man was with Ruthven, he had 2 companions, one of whom, Andrew Henderson, he now dispatched to Gowrie, bidding him prepare dinner for the king. Throughout the chase, Ruthven was ever near the king, always urging him to hasten the end of the hunting. The buck was slain close to the stables, and Ruthven would not allow James to wait for a second horse. So the king did not even tarry to dress the buck, and merely told the Duke of Lennox-Mar and others that he was riding to Perth to speak with Gowrie and would return before evening. Some of the court went to Falkland for fresh horses, others followed slowly with weary steeds. They followed undesired by him, because a report rose that the king had some purpose to apprehend the oppressive master of Oliphant. Ruthven implored James not to bring Lennox and Mar but only 3 or 4 servants, to which the king answered, half angrily. This odd conduct roused suspicion in James. He had been well acquainted with Ruthven, who was suing for the place of a gentleman of the bedchamber. The farthest that the king's suspicion could reach to was, quote, that it might be that the earl his brother had handled him so hardly that the young gentleman, being of a high spirit, had taken such displeasure as he was beside himself, hence his curious, agitated and moody behavior. Unquote. James consulted Lennox, whose first wife had been a sister of Gowrie. Lennox had never seen anything of mental instability in young Ruthven, but James bade the Duke accompany him into that room where the gold and the bearer of it lay. About 2 miles from Perth, Ruthven sent on his other companion, Andrew Ruthven, to Gowrie. When within a mile of Perth, Ruthven himself rode forward in advance. Gowrie, with 50 or 60 men, met James. The royal retinue was then of 15 persons, with swords alone and no daggers. James whispered to Ruthven that he had better see the treasure at once. Ruthven bade him wait and not arouse Gowrie's suspicions by whispering. James therefore directed his conversation to Gowrie, getting from him but half words and imperfect sentences. James, having sat long enough, rose to follow Ruthven, asking him to bring Sir Thomas Erskine with him. Ruthven requested James to command publicly that none should follow at once, promising that he should make any 1 or 2 follow that he pleased to call for. The king then, expecting attendants who never came, because Ruthven never summoned them, walked alone with Ruthven across the end of the hall, up a staircase, and through 3 or 4 chambers, Ruthven locking behind him every door as he passed. At last they reached a turret chamber, where James found not a bondman, but a free man with a dagger at his girdle, and a very abased countenance. Ruthven locked the turret door, put his hat on his head, drew the man's dagger, pointed it at the king's breast, avowing now that the king behooved to be in his will and used as he list, threatening murder if James cried out or opened the window. He also reminded the king of the death of the late Gowrie, his father, who was executed for treason in 1584. Meanwhile, the other man, later identified as a servant of Gowrie's named Henderson, stood trembling and quaking. Then, bidding the other man ward the king, he went out, locking the door behind him. He had first made James swear not to open the window. From here, the king's narrative reverts to matter, not within his own observation. His narrative is amply confirmed on oath by many nobles and gentlemen. He says that, during his own absence, as his train was rising from dinner, one of the earl's servants, Cranstoun, came hastily in, assuring the earl that the king had got to horse and was away through the Isle of Perth. The nobles, going towards the stables for their horses, necessarily passed under the window of the turret on the first floor where James was imprisoned. Ruthven by this time had returned thither, casting his hands abroad in a desperate manner as a man lost. Then, saying that there was no help for it, the king must die, he tried to bind the royal hands with his garter. In the struggle, James drew Ruthven towards the window, already open. At this time, when the king's friends were standing in the street below, Gowrie with them, James shouted for help. Gowrie stood ever asking what it meant, but Lennox, Mar, and others instantly ran in and up the chief staircase to find the king. Meanwhile, James, in his agony, pushed Ruthven out of the turret towards the chamber door, which opened on the dark staircase. James was trying to get hold of Ruthven's sword and draw it, Henderson doing nothing but standing behind the king's back and trembling all the time. At this moment, a young gentleman of the royal household, John Ramsay, entered from the dark back staircase and struck Ruthven with his dagger. Henderson withdrew and fled unimpeded. James then pushed Ruthven down the back stairs, where he was slain by Sir Thomas Erskine and Dr. Herries, who were coming up by that way. The rest, with the death of Gowrie, followed. A tumult of the townsmen, lasting for 2 or 3 hours, delayed the return of James to Falkland. James had thus his version, from which he never varied. From his narrative, only one inference can be drawn. Gowrie and his brother had tried to lure James, almost unattended, to their house. In the turret, they had an armed man who would assist the master to seize the king. Events frustrated the conspiracy. James was well attended. The armed man turned coward, and Gowrie proclaimed the king's departure falsely to make his courtiers follow back to Falkland and so leave the king in the hands of his captors. The plot, once arranged, could not be abandoned because the plotters had no prisoner with a pot of gold to produce, so their intended treason would have been manifest. How far is James's tale corroborated? At the posthumous trial of the Ruthvens in November, witnesses like Lennox swore to his quarter of an hour of talk with Ruthven at Falkland before the hunt. The early arrival of the servant at Gowrie's house, about 10:30, is proved by 2 gentlemen named Hay and one named Moncrief, who were then with Gowrie. Thus the circumstance that Gowrie ordered no dinner for the king, despite Henderson's early arrival with news of his coming, shows that Gowrie meant to effect being taken by surprise. James's opinion that Ruthven was deranged, in consequence of harsh treatment by his brother Gowrie, is explained by a dispute between the brothers about the possession of the church lands of Scone, which Gowrie held and Ruthven desired, the king siding with Ruthven. Again, Lennox on oath averred that, as they rode to Perth, James told him the story of the lure, the pot of gold. Ruthven, on his return to Gowrie's house, told a retainer that he had been on an errand not far off, and accounted for the king's arrival by saying that he was sent by the royal saddler to exact payment of a debt to the man. Now James had just given Gowrie a year's immunity from pursuit of creditors, and there is no trace of the saddler's presence. Clearly, Ruthven lied to the retainer. That Cranstoun, Gowrie's man, brought the news of the king's departure was admitted by himself. That Gowrie went into the house to verify the fact, insisted that it was true, repeated the lie to the porter, who denied it, and tried to make the king's party take horse and follow, was proved on oath. That the king was locked in by a door which could not be burst open is matter of undisputed certainty. All these are facts that should not be disputed. They were disputed, however, when Henderson, Gowrie's steward and a town councillor of Perth, came out of hiding between August 11th and August 20th, told his story and confessed to having been the man in the turret. He said that on the night of August 4th, Gowrie bade him ride very early next day with the master of Ruthven to Falkland and return with any message that Ruthven might send. He did return with news that the king was coming. An hour later, Gowrie bade him put on a shirt of mail and platé sleeves, as he meant to arrest a Highlander living nearby. Later, the king arriving, Henderson was sent to Ruthven and told to do whatever he was bidden. Ruthven then locked him up in the turret, giving no explanation. Presently, the king was brought into the turret, and Henderson pretends that he hampered the violence of Ruthven. During the struggle between Ramsay and Ruthven, he slunk downstairs, went home, and fled that night. Given all this, only one of two theories is possible. The affair was not accidental. James did not fall into a panic and bellow "treason" out of the window merely because he found himself alone in a turret with the master. To that theory, the locked door of the gallery is a conclusive reply. Somebody locked it for some reason. Therefore, either the Ruthvens plotted against the king or the king plotted against the Ruthvens. Both parties had good grounds for hatred. Gowrie and James had motives for quarrel, but with the young master, whose cause, as regards the lands of Scone, the king espoused, he had no reason for anger. If James was guilty, how did he manage his intrigue? With motives for hating Gowrie, let us say, the king lays his plot. He chooses for it a day when he knows that the Murrays of Tullibardine will be in Perth at the wedding of one of the clan. They will defend the king from the townsfolk. James next invites Ruthven to Falkland. He arrives at the strangely early hour of 6 o'clock. James has already invented the story of the pot of gold to be confided to Lennox as proof that Ruthven is bringing him to Perth, that is, he has not invited Ruthven. Next, by secretly spreading a rumour that he means to apprehend the Master of Oliphant, James secures a large train of retainers without firearms, while he escapes the suspicion that would be aroused if he ordered them to accompany him. James has determined to sacrifice Ruthven, with whom he had no quarrel whatever, merely as bait to draw Gowrie into a trap. Having put Lennox off with a false reason for his accompanying Ruthven alone in the house of Gowrie, James privately arranges that Ruthven shall quietly summon him to follow upstairs, meaning to goad Ruthven into a treasonable attitude just as they appear on the scene. He calculates that Lennox, Erskine, or both will then stab Ruthven without asking questions, and that Gowrie will rush up to avenge his brother and be slain. But here His Majesty's deeply considered plot breaks down, since Ruthven summoned neither Lennox nor Erskine. James, observing this circumstance, rapidly and cleverly remodels his plot and does not begin to provoke the brawl till he hears his train talking outside in the street. He had shrewdly provided for their presence there by ordering a servant of his own to spread the false rumour of his departure, which Cranstoun innocently brought. Why did the king do this? As his original idea involved no need of such a stratagem, he had also somehow persuaded Gowrie to credit the rumour and to persist in it, after making no very serious attempt to ascertain its truth. To succeed in making Gowrie do this, in place of thoroughly searching the house, is certainly the king's most striking and inexplicable success. The king has thus two strings to his nefarious bow. The first was that Ruthven, by his orders, would bring Erskine and Lennox, and just as they appeared, James would goad Ruthven into a treasonable attitude, whereon Lennox and Erskine would dirk him. The second plan, if this failed, as it did because Ruthven did not obey orders, was to deceive Gowrie into bringing the retinue under the turret window, so that the king could open the window and cry, "Treason!" as soon as he heard their voices and footsteps below. This plan succeeded. The rest is easy. Gowrie may bring up as many men as he pleases, but Ramsay has had orders to startle him by saying that the king is slain, and then to run him through as he gives ground. This, after a decent form of resistance, in which 3 of the king's 4 men are wounded. To secure a witness to the truth of his false version of the matter, James must have begun by artfully bribing Henderson, Gowrie's steward, either simply to run away and then come in later with corroboration, or actually to be present in the turret and then escape. Historian Hill Burton says, "The theory that the whole was a plot of the court to ruin the powerful house of Gowrie must at once, after a calm weighing of the evidence, be dismissed as beyond the range of sane conclusions. Those who formed it had to put one of the very last men in the world to accept of such a destiny into the position of an unarmed man who, without any preparation, was to render himself into the hands of his armed adversaries, and cause a succession of surprises and acts of violence, which, by his own courage and dexterity, he would rule to a determined and preconcerted plan. All this hypothesis is starkly incredible. James was not a recklessly adventurous character to go weaponless with Ruthven, who wore a sword and provoke him into insolence. If he had been ever so brave, the plot is of a complexity quite impossible. No sane man, still less a timid man, could conceive and execute a plot at the mercy of countless circumstances not to be foreseen. Suppose the master slain and Gowrie a free man in the street. He had only to sound the alarm, summon his devoted townsmen, surround the house and ask respectfully for explanations. On the other hand, consider the theory of Gowrie's guilt. Here the motives for evil will on either side may be briefly stated. Since the murder of Riccio and attack on Queen Mary, the Ruthvens had been the foes of the crown. Gowrie's grandfather and father were leaders in the attack on Mary and Riccio. Gowrie's father insulted Queen Mary by amorous advances, or so she declares. In July 1593, Gowrie's mother enabled the Earl of Bothwell again to kidnap the king. A year later, our Gowrie, then a lad, joined Bothwell in open rebellion. There is no evidence to prove a plot by Gowrie beyond the whole nature of the events and the strange conduct of himself and his brother. But if plot he did, he merely carried out, in the interests of his English friends, the traditional policy of his grandfather, his father, his mother and his ally Bothwell, at this time an exile in Spain. While the king was a free man, Gowrie could not hope to raise the discontented barons and emancipate the preachers who had summoned him home. Let the king vanish, and the coast was clear. Gowrie's party, the Kirk's party, the English party, would triumph. The inference is that the king was to be made to disappear, and that Gowrie undertook to do it. Such a purpose as the trapping of the king by a secret and sudden attack was the mere commonplace of Scottish politics. That men so very young as the two Ruthvens should plan such a device, romantic and perilous, is no matter for marvel. The plot itself must be judged by its original idea, namely to lure James to Perth with only 2 or 3 servants. Matters fell out otherwise. Had the king entered Gowrie House early and scantily attended, he might have been conveyed across Fife. Thence he might be conveyed by sea to a strong fortification on Gowrie land. A plot of this kind is not impossible, like the quite incredible conspiracy attributed to James. The scheme was only one of scores of the same sort, constantly devised at that time. The thing next to impossible is that Henderson was left, as he declared, in the turret by Ruthven, without being tutored in his role. The king's party did not believe that Henderson here told truth. He had accepted the role, they said, but turned coward. This is the more likely. We conclude that as there certainly was a Ruthven plot, as the king could not possibly have invented and carried out the affair, and that as Gowrie, the leader of the plot, planned a device of the regular and usual kind, but was frustrated and fell into the pit which he had dug.